History remembers Medusa as a monster, the snake-haired Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone, the creature slain by a hero with a mirrored shield. But what if that face was never meant to be a weapon? What if it was given to her by a goddess who should have protected her? The story you know begins with a hero. The story you are about to hear begins earlier, in a temple, in silence. In the moment before everything was taken from a woman who had done nothing wrong. Now let that thought settle. Let your shoulders fall, just slightly, away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a path that leads away from the world you know. Away from the hero, away from the victory, away from the version of the story where the monster is simply evil and the ending is simply happy. Somewhere ahead, a woman is standing at the edge of the sea. She has been standing there a very long time. What waits for you is not a tale of horror, but something quieter. The long, slow unwinding of a tragedy that did not end when the blade fell. If this channel feels like a place you want to return to, you are welcome to stay. But there is no rush. There is only the story. So let the path carry you back before the hero. Back before the gods had even decided what this story would be. Back to the temple. Back to the flame. Back to the girl who tended it. Chapter 1. Edge of the Known World. Before the name or the curse, a girl tended a flame. The temple stood at the edge of the known world, where the land gave way to a sea that had no far shore. It was not a grand sanctuary of marble and gold, but a small, weathered structure of pale limestone, its columns worn smooth by centuries of salt wind. Olive trees grew close around it, silver green and ancient, their roots gripping the rocky earth. Inside, a single flame burned in a bronze tripod, never allowed to die. The flame had been entrusted to a young priestess, whose name, in those days, was not yet a curse. She had come to the temple as a girl, given by her family in an act of piety, and she had learned the old rhythms of devotion. The tending of the fire, the offering of oil, the long silences between prayers. Her hair was dark and unadorned. Her hands were steady. The goddess she served was Athena, and the sanctuary was hers. Each morning she rose before the sun and walked the stone path from her small chamber to the sanctuary, the air cool and fragrant with wild thyme. She would kneel before the tripod and add oil to the flame, watching it brighten, feeling the warmth on her face. The temple was quiet then, the only sound the soft rush of the sea below the cliffs and the occasional cry of a gull. She did not feel lonely. She felt held. The people of the region knew the temple and respected it, though few made the journey to its remote promontory. Travelers sometimes passed through, seeking shelter or a blessing, and she received them with the same quiet grace with which she did everything. They would leave offerings, small bronze coins, dried flowers, a twist of wool, and she would place them at the foot of the altar. No one stayed long. The edge of the world was not a place for lingering. She had been told, when she was young, that her beauty was unusually thing to be noted, perhaps guarded. The older priestesses had remarked on it, not with envy, but with a kind of watchful concern. Beauty in a sanctuary was a complicated gift, they said. It drew the eye, and the gods, for all their distance, were not always content to look from afar. She had not understood then. She had simply continued tending the flame. The day it happened began like any other. She rose in the darkness, walked the stone path, knelt before the flame. The morning light came pale and golden through the eastern window, falling across the marble floor in a long rectangle. She was alone. The temple was still, and then the doors opened, not slowly, not with the careful hand of a supplicant, but with the weight of something that did not need permission. He came as the sea comes immense, cold, and without warning. Poseidon had no business in Athena's sanctuary, but the gods are not bound by the boundaries they set for mortals. He filled the doorway, and the air changed. The flame guttered. The walls seemed to contract. She did not scream. There was no one to hear, and no time, and no word in any language she knew for what was happening. The sanctuary had been a place of stillness and devotion. In the space of a few moments, it became something else, a room where a god took what he wanted and left. The altar was not toppled. The tripod was not broken, but the silence afterward was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a wound that had not yet begun to understand itself. She knelt on the marble and did not move. The flame should have died. It had faltered to almost nothing, a thin blue thread trembling above the oil. But it did not die. It clung to the wick, and after a long while, it began to steady, as though the temple itself was unwilling to surrender its only light. Outside, the sea went on crashing against the cliffs. The gulls still cried. Nothing visible had changed. Everything had. When Athena came, it was not as a comforter. She appeared in the doorway as Poseidon had, but where he had been, heavy with the sea, she was sharp as a blade. The goddess looked at the altar, at the trembling flame, at the young woman who had kept it so faithfully. Her expression was unreadable. In the cold, silver light that seemed to follow her, the priestess lifted her head. She did not yet understand that she was about to be punished. What passed between the goddess and the priestess in that moment has never been recorded. The ancient sources do not give us Medusa's voice. They give us Athena's judgment, swift, absolute, and directed not at the god who had committed the violation, but at the woman whose sanctuary had been defiled. Perhaps the goddess could not punish Poseidon. Perhaps she chose not to. The temple had been profaned, and someone had to carry the weight of that desecration. The logic of the gods is not the logic of mortals. Athena did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. She had seen, or she had not needed to see, or the seeing of it mattered less than the fact of it. The sanctuary had been broken. The flame had nearly been extinguished. The priestess, however blameless, was now the site of the crime. Her body had become evidence, and evidence, in the economy of the divine, could be erased. Athena spoke. The words themselves were few, and they fell into the silence like stones into still water. The young woman who had tended the flame with such devotion would continue to serve, but not in this temple, not in any temple. She would be sent to the very edge of things, where the world gives out and the sea has no name. And she would not go as a priestess. She would go as something else entirely. There is a particular stillness that comes over a person who has just understood that their life has been decided without them. The priestess did not weep. She did not plead. She remained kneeling on the cold marble, her hands resting on her thighs, her dark hair falling forward. The flame behind her had steadied. It burned now, as it had always burned, as though nothing had happened, as though the temple had not been hollowed out by what had passed through it. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to imagine that this was the worst moment, that the violation itself, or the goddess's judgment, marked the bottom of the descent. But the worst moment was not the crime, and it was not the sentence. The worst moment was the dawning understanding that no one would ever ask what she wanted. Not Poseidon, not Athena, not the world that would come after. She was a woman, and she was alone, and her story was already being written by other hands. Athena departed. The cold silver light went with her, and the sanctuary settled back into its familiar shadows. The flame burned on. Outside, the sea continued its patient work against the cliffs. The priestess remained where she was for a long time, and the temple held her in its quiet, as it had always done, though it could not protect her from what was coming. It never had. When she finally rose, her legs were stiff and cold from the marble. She walked to the altar and looked at it, at the bronze tripod, at the small clay vessel of oil, at the offerings left by travelers who had passed through and gone on with their lives. She did not touch anything. She did not say goodbye. She simply turned and walked toward the temple doors, which stood open now to the pale morning light. The path away from the temple was the same path she had walked every morning, but it felt different beneath her feet. The olive trees seemed older, their silver leaves stirring in a wind that had not been there before. The wild thyme released its scent as she passed, and the sound of the sea rose up from below the cliffs. She was still herself. She was still a woman with dark hair and steady hands. But something had already begun to change, deep in the roots of things, where even she could not yet feel it. She did not know where she was going. The goddess had not given her a destination, only a sentence. But her body seemed to know. Her feet carried her westward, away from the temple, away from the waking world, toward a place where the light grew thinner and the land grew strange. She walked without stopping, and as she walked, the sky ahead of her began to darken into a perpetual dusk. The temple flame would continue to burn. Another priestess would tend it. The sanctuary would be cleansed and rededicated, and the name of the woman who had once knelt there would be removed from memory. But at the edge of the world, where the sea has no name and the light never fully arrives, something was waiting. Not a monster, not yet. Only a woman walking toward a darkness that had been chosen for her, carrying nothing but the weight of what had been done to her, and the first faint stirring of something she did not yet recognize in the roots of her hair. Chapter 2. The Curse That Was Meant to Protect. She felt the first serpent stir and knew no one would come close again. She walked for days, or perhaps it was longer. Time had begun to feel strange at the edge of the world. The landscape thinned around her. The olive trees gave way to thorny scrub, then to bare rock, then to a silence so deep she could hear her own breath. The sea had changed too. It was no longer the blue Aegean, but something darker, colder, a body of water that had no name and no far shore. This was Oceanus, and she had reached it. The shore was a desolate shelf of fractured limestone, worn smooth in places by the endless working of the water. No birds cried here. No fishing boats dotted the horizon. The air smelled of salt and cold stone, and something older, something that had been waiting. She stood at the edge of the rocks and looked out at the water, and for the first time since leaving the temple, she stopped walking. There was nowhere left to go. She was not alone. She sensed them before she saw them. Two figures emerging from the mouth of a low cavern set into the cliffs above the shore. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, and as they drew closer, she saw that they were women, or had been women once. Their faces were beautiful and terrible, their hair a mass of living serpents that coiled and shifted in the cold wind. These were her sisters, though she had never met them, Steno and Euryale. They did not speak. They did not need to. They came to her across the stony ground and stood on either side of her, looking out at the same dark water. Their serpents hissed softly, a dry, rustling sound, like wind through dead leaves. Euryale reached out and touched her arm with a hand that was cool and surprisingly gentle. Stephanos simply stood and watched the horizon. They had been waiting for her. They had known she would come. The sisters were immortal. That was the difference. The thing that had been decided long before any of them were born. Stefano and Euryale would live forever, their strange beauty preserved against time. Medusa alone had been given mortality, a single fragile thread that could be cut. She did not yet know whether this was a mercy or a further cruelty. Standing between her sisters, feeling the cold wind off Oceanus, she suspected it was neither. It was simply a fact, waiting to be used. The first change came in her hair. She felt it as a faint tingling at the roots, a warmth that was not unpleasant, like the flush of blood after cold. She raised a hand to her scalp and felt nothing different. The same dark strands, the same familiar weight. But the sensation did not fade. It grew, spreading across her skull in slow waves. And with it came a sound she could not place, a dry whisper that seemed to come from somewhere very close. She looked at her sisters, and they were watching her with expressions she could not read. Sorrow, perhaps, or something older than sorrow. Euryala's serpents had grown still, their heads turned toward Medusa, as if listening. Stethano did not move. The wind had died. The water had gone silent. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. And then she felt the first strand of hair move on its own. In that moment, exactly what Athena had done. The curse was not a punishment for what had happened in the temple. It was a protection that would never let anyone come close enough to hurt her again. It was not hair anymore. She pulled a lock forward and watched as it thickened and shifted in her hand, the dark strand becoming something else, a slender serpent, smooth and cool, its scales catching the pale light. It lifted its head and looked at her with eyes the color of old bronze, and she understood. The transformation did not happen all at once. It moved through her hair in slow waves, strand by strand, a gradual surrender. She felt each one stir, thicken, lift away from her neck. The serpents were not violent. They coiled and settled against her shoulders, like creatures finding their place. Her scalp tingled and burned, but the pain was distant, almost belonging to someone else. She stood very still, her hands at her sides, and let it happen. There was nothing else to do. Her sisters watched in silence. Uriel had begun to weep a quiet, steady stream of tears that her serpents licked gently from her cheeks. Stethano remained motionless, her face set in the rigid composure of someone who has seen too much to cry anymore. Between them, Medusa stood with her new crown of serpents, her hair transformed into a living mantle. She was still herself. She was still the woman who had tended the flame. But her face was the last thing left to change. Her face was the last thing to change, and it changed from within. She felt it first behind her eyes, a pressure, a gathering heat, as though something was being poured into her gaze. She blinked, and the rocks at her feet seemed sharper. She blinked again, and the light around her bent strangely. Her sisters stepped back, not in fear, but in recognition. The power had arrived. The weapon was being forged. There is a particular grief in becoming something you did not choose. She lifted her hands to her face and felt the same skin, the same bones, the same lips that had whispered prayers in a temple. But she knew that anyone who looked upon her now would never see the priestess. They would see only the terror. Her eyes, once dark and steady, now held a brilliance that could not be looked at directly, a light that stopped breath, that stilled hearts, that turned flesh to stone. She did not test it. She did not need to. The knowledge of what she could do settled into her like an old memory recovered, something she had always known, but had never before understood. The serpents in her hair moved gently, their tongues tasting the air, their bodies warm against her scalp. She was not in pain. The transformation was complete. She was something new now, something that had never existed before. She was Medusa, the Gorgon. Her sisters came back to her side. Uriel reached out and took her hand, and Medusa felt the cool, immortal skin against her own still warm palm. Stethano placed a hand on her shoulder, and the three of them stood there at the edge of Oceanus. 3 women with serpents for hair. 3 daughters of a lineage that had never asked to be born. The difference now was only that Medusa could die. The difference was that her mortality made her the one the world would remember. The cavern became her home. It was a low, dark opening in the limestone cliffs above the shore, its walls worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt. Inside, the air was still and cool. The serpents seemed to like it there. They grew calmer in the darkness, resting against her shoulders with a soft, continuous rustling. She learned their weight, their movements, the way they responded to her moods. They were not separate from her. They were her, and she was them. There is no need to picture the transformation too precisely. It is enough to know that it happened, and that she was alone inside it, and that when it was finished, she was no longer the woman who had knelt before the flame. The flame was still burning somewhere, far away, tended by other hands. But she would never see it again. She would never see anything again, except through the lens of what she had become. Word of her existence spread slowly across the ancient world. It traveled in whispers, in the frightened accounts of sailors who had sailed too far west, in the tales told by travelers who had seen the petrified forms on the shore. A Gorgon, they said, at the edge of the world, a creature whose face could turn a man to stone. They did not say that she had once been a priestess. They did not say that she had not chosen this. They said only what she was now. The first warriors came not long after. They were brave men, or foolish men, or men who had been sent by kings who wanted the Gorgon's head as a trophy. They came with swords and shields, and the confidence of those who have never encountered something truly beyond them. Medusa did not summon them. She did not hunt them. She simply existed, and they came to her, and they looked at her, and they turned to stone. She never touched a single one. The plain before the cavern began to fill with statues. They stood in frozen attitudes of approach, swords half drawn, shields raised, mouths open in shouts that had never been completed. Some had turned to stone mid-stride, their stone feet still carrying the memory of forward motion. Medusa walked among them sometimes, her serpents quiet, her gaze averted. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel sorrow. She felt only the weight of what she was becoming, and the slow, cold certainty that this would be her life until the end of it. Years passed. The statues multiplied. The world learned to avoid the western shore, and the Gorgon became a legend, told to frighten children and to caution the ambitious. But before any hero could take up arms against her, before the gods would arm a boy with winged sandals and a mirrored shield, the story had to settle into its long middle age, that quiet, terrible stretch when Medusa was simply there, waiting at the edge of things, not yet a victim and not yet a victory, only a woman whose face had become the loneliest place on earth. Chapter 3. The Garden of Stone. She never summoned a single one. They came, and they stayed. The years settled over the western shore like sediment, layer upon layer, until the Gorgon's domain felt as ancient as the rock itself. The plain before the cavern had become a garden of stone, its figures arranged not by design, but by the simple logic of approach and death. Warriors stood frozen mid-stride, their bronze greaves catching the pale dusk light. A horse had turned to stone, with its rider still mounted, its legs locked in a gallop that would never end. Even the birds were not spared. Each statue told a story that had ended the same way. A king from a distant city had come with 50 men and left as 50 monuments, his own stone face still twisted with the confidence he had worn when he set out. A young hunter, barely more than a boy, had wandered too far west, chasing a stag, and now stood forever with his bow half raised. A priest had brought offerings and prayers, and the offerings remained where he had placed them, his stone hands still extended in supplication. The statues weathered slowly. Wind and salt wore down the finer details. A nose here, a raised finger there, but the forms held. Some had begun to grow lichen, pale gray-green patches spreading across stone cheeks and stone shields. Medusa walked among them when the dusk was particularly still, her serpents quiet, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead of her feet. She had learned long ago not to look at them directly. They were her work, but she had never meant to make them. There is no need to picture every face in that frozen crowd. It is enough to know that the plain was full, and that she had never once summoned a single person to it. They came. They always came. And when they met her eyes, whether in terror or defiance, or a simple accident, The stone took them where they stood. She did not hunt. She did not pursue. She simply existed. And the world kept sending men who thought they could survive a glance. The cavern itself was a low, wide opening in the limestone cliffs, its mouth facing the dark water of Oceanus. Inside, the walls were smooth in places, where the sisters had leaned against them for centuries, the stone polished by the slow friction of immortal bodies. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint mineral scent of damp limestone. In the deepest part of the cavern, where the light never reached, the serpents would sometimes grow so still that Medusa could almost forget they were there. The serpents had become, over time, a strange kind of company. They were not pets, not separate creatures, but extensions of her own body. And yet they had their own temperaments. Some were restless, constantly tasting the air with flickering tongues. Others were calm, content to coil against her scalp and doze for hours. When she was sorrowful, they grew still. When she was angry, and she was angry. Sometimes, in ways she could not speak, they would rise and hiss, a chorus of dry voices speaking the language she could not. She had learned to read the world through them. Their tongues caught scents long before her human senses could. The salt of the sea, the distant smoke of a ship, the faint animal warmth of an approaching traveler. They tasted fear most sharply. When warriors came, the serpents would stir before the men were even visible, their bodies tightening, their heads turning toward the unseen threat. Medusa would feel the warning in her scalp and know that more stone was about to join the garden. Her sisters were her only other company, and they were not always present. Stethano and Euryale, being immortal, experienced time differently. They would sometimes vanish into the back of the cavern for what felt like years, emerging unchanged, their serpent hair moving with the same slow rhythm. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in a language older than any human tongue, a sound like stones grinding together far beneath the earth. Medusa understood fragments, her name, the word for grief, the word for waiting. The immortals mourned constantly. It was a low, keening sound that rose from the cavern at odd hours and drifted across the petrified plain toward the sea. Sailors who passed too close to the western shore would hear it and change course, believing it to be the wind or the cries of something that should not be disturbed. But it was only Stethano and Euryale grieving their mortal sister while she was still alive, because they knew what she did not yet fully understand, that her death had been written into the world the moment she was made. The rituals of avoidance grew elaborate over the generations. Fishermen painted eyes on the prows of their boats to ward off the Gorgon's gaze. Temples built near the western coasts included small Gorgonea above their doors, Medusa's own face, rendered in stone or terracotta, believed to repel the very power it depicted. She knew nothing of this. She sat in her cavern, her serpents resting, and the world beyond the horizon built its defenses against a woman who had never wanted to be a weapon. She did not know about the Gorgonia. She did not know that her face had become a symbol painted on shields and carved above doorways, a ward against the evil that her own story had come to represent. She knew only the cavern, the plain, the serpents, and the long gray twilight that never lifted. Sometimes she would sit at the mouth of the cave and watch the dark water of Oceanus, and the immensity of it would comfort her in a way she could not explain. The sea asked nothing of her. It never had. Her body changed slowly over the years. The transformation had not ended with her hair and her eyes. Her skin grew paler, taking on the faint gray-green cast of old marble, and her nails hardened into something closer to talon than fingernail. She did not age that much. Her sister's immortality seemed to have granted her, or perhaps it was simply another element of the curse. She remained the same woman, year after year, while the world beyond the shore turned through its seasons and its generations. The serpents did not age either. They shed their skins in delicate papery coils that collected in the corners of the cavern, catching the pale light like discarded garments. Sometimes Medusa would gather them and let them blow away across the plain, watching them tumble among the stone feet of the warriors. She did not know why she did this. It felt like a small ritual, a tiny act of maintenance in a life that had no real shape beyond endurance. She had stopped thinking of herself as a priestess. The memory of the temple flame had grown distant, softened by time, until it was less a memory than a story she had once been told about someone else. She could recall the scent of the oil, the warmth on her face, the smoothness of the marble beneath her knees. But the woman who had experienced those things felt like a stranger. That woman had been looked at without consequence. That woman had been able to meet another's eyes. There is no need to imagine the weight of such isolation. It is enough to know that she bore it, day after day, and that she bore it without cruelty and without madness. She did not become the monster the world believed her to be. She became something quieter, a guardian of a threshold no one needed to cross, a keeper of a desolation that asked nothing of her but that she remain. Her sister's keening was the soundtrack of her existence. It rose and fell in long, slow waves, sometimes soft as breath, sometimes sharp enough to carry across the water. She had learned to sleep through it, her serpents curled against her neck like a living blanket. In her dreams, she was sometimes still human, walking through olive groves in bright sunlight, her hair blowing loose and ordinary in a warm wind. She would wake to the gray dusk, and the salt cold, and the gap between the dream and the waking was the hardest thing she carried. Travelers still came, though fewer than before. The legend had grown thick enough to deter most. But there were always exceptions: the desperate, the arrogant, the young men who believed that stories were exaggerations. They arrived with weapons and prayers, and sometimes with gifts, laying small offerings at the edge of the plain before advancing. The offerings remained where they were left, slowly buried by wind-blown dust. Medusa never touched them. She did not want their tribute. She wanted to be left alone. But alone was the one thing the world would not let her be. The petrified plain was not silent. The wind made a low, constant sound as it moved among the stone figures, a hollow hum that changed pitch with the weather. Sometimes, when the wind was strong, it would catch in the open mouths of the statues and produce a faint whistling, as though the dead were trying to speak. Medusa had grown so accustomed to this that she no longer heard it. It was simply the voice of her home, as familiar as the rustle of her serpents or the distant crash of Oceanus against the rocks below. She did not know that her name was being passed through the world like a warning. She did not know that kings offered rewards for her head, that poets were beginning to compose verses about the Gorgon at the edge of the world, that her image was being painted on amphorae and carved into temple metopes. She lived entirely within the small circumference of her existence: cavern, plain, shore, sisters, serpents, dusk. And within that circumference, she had found a kind of peace. It was not happiness. It was not even contentment. It was simply the absence of further violation. But the world was not finished with her. Far across the sea, in a city of white stone and busy harbors, a king was about to set a trap for a young man he wanted dead. And the bait he would use, without knowing it, was the head of a woman who had already suffered enough. The hero was coming. The gods were already choosing their gifts. And somewhere in the long dusk of the western shore, Medusa slept, her serpents still, unaware that the story of her life was about to become the story of her death. Chapter 4. The Weight of Borrowed Wings. He practiced with the mirrored shield, and his own face was all he ever saw. The hero was not yet a hero when the story found him. He was a young man living on the island of Seriphos, a place of white stone and bright harbors, far removed from the gray dusk where Medusa waited. His name was Perseus, and he carried his own weight. Son of Danae, grandson of a king who had set them both adrift in a wooden chest, survivor of a sea that should have drowned him. The gods had been watching him since before he was born. His mother, Denia, had her own story, one that echoed strangely with the woman at the edge of the world. She too had been desired by a god who did not ask. Zeus had come to her as a shower of gold, and she had borne a son, and for that she had been sealed in a chest with her infant and thrown into the sea. They had washed ashore on Seriphos, alive against all odds, and a fisherman named Dictys had taken them in. Perseus grew up in the shadow of that survival. But Seriphos had a king, and the king had noticed Danae. Polydectes was his name, a man of smooth words and cold intentions, who wanted the woman who had washed up on his shore and wanted her son removed from the equation. He could not simply kill Perseus. That would be too obvious, too crude. So he devised something more elegant. He announced that he would seek a bride, not Danae, he claimed, but another, and that all his subjects must provide a gift worthy of the occasion. Perseus had nothing to give. He was young, proud, and cornered, and in a moment of bravado, he declared that if the king wished, he would bring him the head of Medusa herself. It was a foolish boast, the kind a young man makes when he has no other currency but his own courage. Polydectes smiled. The trap had closed. The king accepted the offer and held him to it. And suddenly, Perseus was bound to an impossible task, to kill a creature whose face no man could look upon and live. There is no need to imagine the dread that settled over him in the days that followed. It is enough to know that he felt it, and that it was heavy, and that he was young enough to believe that courage meant the absence of fear rather than the endurance of it. He walked the shore of Seriphos alone, watching the sea that had nearly killed him once and now seemed to be calling him toward a second, more certain death. The gulls cried overhead. The water was bright and indifferent. But the gods had been watching. They had been watching since the golden shower, since the chest, since the fisherman's kindness. And they were not finished with this story. Hermes came first, the messenger, the trickster, the god who moved between worlds. He found Perseus on the shore and stood beside him in the salt wind. And when he spoke, it was with the casual confidence of someone who has already seen how the story ends. He brought winged sandals, and he brought something else, the name of the next god who would help. Athena came second. She appeared not in the cold silver light of judgment, but with something closer to purpose, her gray eyes steady and unreadable. She carried a shield, not the great aegis she bore into battle, but a smaller, polished disc of bronze so perfectly reflective that Perseus could see his own face in it as clearly as in still water. She told him he would need it. She told him he must never look directly at what he had come to kill. She did not apologize for what she had done to the woman whose face now required such precautions. Hades gave the third gift, though. The god of the dead did not appear in person. His helm of darkness was delivered by hands unseen, a thing of shadow and silence that, when worn, made the wearer invisible. It was a gift of terrible intimacy, the power to move through the world unseen, to become a ghost before one's own death. Perseus held it in his hands, and felt the cold weight of the underworld pressing against his palms. And he understood that the gods were not merely helping him. They were investing in him. He was their instrument now, but he still did not know where to go. The Gorgon's lair was a secret guarded by creatures older than maps, and so the gods sent him to the Graeae, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, passing them back and forth in the darkness of a cave that smelled of old stone and older breath. They were the Grey Ones, the Watchers, and they knew the way. Perseus waited in the shadows until the eye was passing from one hand to another, and then he took it. The Graeae wailed and clawed at the darkness, blind and desperate, and Perseus held the eye and made his bargain. "Tell me where the Gorgons are, and I will return what I have taken," they told him. They had no choice, and when he gave back the eye, he had a direction westward, always westward, toward the place where the sun goes down and the light gives out, and three sisters with serpent hair wait for a hero who will never come. Only this time, a hero was coming. He had the sandals, the shield, the helm, the sickle. He had the gods behind him. He rose into the sky and flew west. The winged sandals carried him above the sea, and the world fell away beneath him. Islands became small as coins, then smaller, then vanished into the haze. The wind was cold at that height, and it pulled at his hair and his cloak and made his eyes water. He flew for days, or perhaps longer. Time had a different quality when the earth was only a distant abstraction. Below him, the blue Aegean gradually darkened into something stranger, and he knew he was crossing into waters that had no names. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a boy wearing borrowed armor, carrying gifts he had not earned, flying toward a confrontation he did not fully believe he would survive. The sickle was heavy at his belt. The helm sat cold against his thigh. The mirrored shield was strapped across his back, and sometimes he would reach back and touch its polished surface, as if to remind himself that he was still real, still visible, still alive. He practiced with the shield during the long hours of flight. It was an awkward skill to learn, navigating by reflection, moving toward something while looking away from it. He held the bronze disc at arm's length and walked himself through the motions, learning to read depth and distance in reverse. His own face gazed back at him, young and uncertain, and he wondered if it would be the last face he ever saw. The shield showed him only himself, over and over. It would not show him what was coming. He thought about the woman he had been sent to kill. He knew the stories, every Greek child knew the stories, but he found himself turning over the details in his mind. A Gorgon, they said. A monster with serpents for hair. A face that turned men to stone. But no one ever said why. No one ever said how she had come to be that way, or what she had been before, or whether she had chosen any of it. Perseus did not yet know the full truth, but the question was already forming in him, quiet and persistent. The landscape below him began to change. The sea grew darker, the islands fewer, until there was only open water stretching toward a horizon that never seemed to arrive. Then, at last, a coastline emerged, not the bright limestone of the Greek world, but a low, gray shore of fractured rock and sparse vegetation. The light was thinner here, the sky a wash of pale violet and silver. He was entering the perpetual dusk of the far west, and something in his chest tightened. He was close. He descended slowly, the sandals lowering him toward the shore with a gentleness that felt almost reverent. The air was cold and carried the scent of salt and wet stone. He could hear the slow crash of water against rock, and beneath that, a fainter sound, a low, keening note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He did not know it was the sound of immortal sisters grieving. He only knew that it made the hair on his arms stand up. The helm of darkness was in his hand now. He had not yet put it on, but he could feel its cold weight, the promise of invisibility pressing against his palm. He understood that once he wore it, he would become something less than human, and more than human at the same time. A ghost with a heartbeat, a shadow with a blade. He was not ready. He did not have the luxury of waiting until he was ready. He strapped the helm to his belt and kept walking. The petrified plain came into view slowly, emerging from the gray dusk like a memory surfacing. At first, he thought the shapes ahead were rock formations, weathered by wind and sea. Then he saw the bronze glint of a shield, the curve of a helmet, the outstretched arm of a man who had been running. The statues were everywhere, hundreds of them, scattered across the stony ground in attitudes of approach and flight. Perseus stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply stood and looked at what had happened to everyone who had come before him. He did not turn back. He had come too far, and the king was waiting, and his mother was waiting, and the gods who had armed him would not accept a retreat. But he understood now, with a clarity that cut deeper than fear, exactly what he was walking toward. This was not a monster's lair. This was a graveyard. And somewhere in the cavern ahead, the graveyard's keeper was sleeping, her serpents still, her face turned away from the entrance, unaware that the ending the gods had written for her was about to arrive on winged sandals. He put on the helm of darkness and vanished from the visible world. The mirrored shield was in his left hand, the adamantine sickle in his right. Ahead of him, the mouth of the cavern opened like a wound in the limestone cliffs. The keening of the immortal sisters had grown louder. Or perhaps he was simply closer to its source. He moved forward without sound, without shadow, a young man who had become invisible, walking through a garden of the dead toward a woman who had never wanted to be a weapon. The descent had begun. Chapter 5. The Silence After the Blade. She was asleep when the blade fell, and then she was free. The cavern opened around him like a mouth, and the darkness inside was different from the dusk outside. It was older, thicker, a darkness that had pooled in the limestone for centuries. Perseus moved through it without sound, the helm of darkness making him a ghost among shadows. The mirrored shield was raised before him, its polished surface catching the faintest glimmers of light from somewhere deeper in the cave. He navigated by reflection alone, walking backward into the unknown. The air grew warmer as he descended, carrying a scent he could not name, something dry and faintly sweet, like old herbs left in a temple corner. And beneath it, the sound of breathing, slow, rhythmic, multiplied. He could not tell how many sources there were. The shield showed him only the rough limestone walls sliding past, the occasional glint of a serpent scale catching light that had no visible origin. He kept moving. The invisible does not hurry. The passage widened, and the shield showed him what waited. 3 figures lay sleeping on the smooth stone floor of a broad chamber, their forms arranged without order, as though they had settled where exhaustion had found them. 2 of them stirred restlessly even in sleep, their serpent hair moving with a slow, uneasy rhythm. The third lay apart from the others, smaller, stiller, her serpents coiled against her scalp, like children who had finally stopped asking questions. Steno and Euryale slept the sleep of the immortal shallow, watchful, never fully surrendered. Their serpents lifted their heads occasionally, tasting the air, then subsided again. Their faces were beautiful and severe, worn by centuries of grief into something that resembled stone before stone had touched them. They lay close together, as though, even in sleep, they could not bear to be separated from the one loss they knew was coming. But Medusa slept differently. Her sleep was deep and absolute, the sleep of a mortal body that had been carrying too much weight for too long. Her serpents were utterly still, their tiny eyes closed, their bodies soft against her temples and neck. Her face, reflected in the polished bronze, was not the face of a monster. It was the face of a woman who had been tired for centuries and had finally, briefly, found rest. Perseus looked at her reflection and felt something he had not expected. There is no need to describe her beauty too precisely. It is enough to know that it was there, still visible beneath the scales and the talons and the crown of serpents, and that Perseus saw it in the reflection and understood, for the first time, that the story he had been told was incomplete. This was not a creature that had risen from the earth to terrorize the world. This was a woman who had been transformed against her will, and her face in the shield was the only face she had left. He did not hesitate. The gods had armed him for a purpose, and the king was waiting, and his mother was waiting, and hesitation would not restore what had been taken from her. But he did not rush either. He moved with a slowness that was almost reverent, positioning himself at the edge of her sleeping form, the mirrored shield held steady in his left hand, the adamantine sickle in his right. The blade caught the faint light and held it. Her serpents did not stir, Not a single one opened its eyes. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to the silence of the cavern. Or perhaps some part of them knew that what was coming was not a threat, but a release. Medusa's face in the shield was peaceful in a way it had not been when she was awake. The brow unfurrowed, the lips slightly parted, the long dark lashes resting against cheeks that had once been human and still remembered how to be soft. The sickle moved through the air without sound. It was a curved, elegant thing, forged in forges that had never known mortal hands, and it knew its work. The blade found the space between sleep and waking, between the curse and its ending, and it passed through it with a single, irreversible motion. There was no struggle. There was no cry. The serpents did not rise. Medusa's face in the shield did not change. The peace remained. And then there was only stillness, a stillness deeper than any that had come before. The blade had done what blades do, and what followed was not horror, but silence. Perseus stood in the darkness, invisible, breathing, the shield still raised. In the reflection, he could see the two immortal sisters beginning to stir, their serpents lifting their heads, their mouths opening on sounds that would become the loudest grief he had ever heard. But he did not look away from the reflection of the woman who was now, at last, no longer suffering. He moved quickly now, the reverence of the moment giving way to the cold demands of survival. From his belt, he drew the cabesus, the enchanted pouch the nymphs had given him, its interior deeper than its shape should allow. He did not look directly at what he placed inside it. The mirrored shield remained raised, and in its surface he watched his own hands work, watched the dark mass of serpents fold into the pouch, watched the face that was finally at peace disappear into the darkness of the bag. The wail that rose behind him was not human. It was the sound of immortals waking to a loss they had spent centuries dreading. Stethano and Euralia rose from their sleep like storm clouds gathering over the sea, their serpents twisting and screaming, their hands clawing at the empty space where their sister had lain. They could not see Perseus, the helm of darkness held, but they could smell him, mortal and warm, and they could feel the absence he had made. He ran. The winged sandals lifted him from the stone floor and carried him through the passage, the shield still raised to guide his flight. Behind him, the sisters came in a fury of scales and keening, their talons scoring the limestone walls. The cavern shook with their grief. Perseus did not turn. He did not look back. He flew through the darkness, with one hand on the cabesus and one hand on the shield, and the sound of mourning followed him all the way to the light. He burst from the cavern mouth into the gray dusk of the western shore, and the sandals carried him upward, higher and higher, until the cave was a dark speck on the cliffs, and the petrified plain was a gray smudge below. The sisters did not follow him into the open air. They remained at the mouth of the cavern, their wailing carrying across the water, a lament that would not stop for days. Perseus climbed into the sky and did not look down. The cabeces was heavy against his side, heavier than it should have been for its size. He could feel the warmth of what it held, a faint, living heat that had not yet faded. He did not open it. He did not want to see what he had done. Not yet. Not while the adrenaline was still singing in his blood, and the sound of the sisters was still echoing in his ears. He flew east, toward the rising sun, carrying death in a bag woven by immortal hands. Behind him, the cavern settled back into silence. Stetho and Euryale would remain there forever, immortal and inconsolable, their keening becoming part of the landscape itself. The body of their sister lay where she had fallen, no longer a Gorgon, no longer a weapon, only a woman whose long punishment was over. The serpents had stilled. The face had not changed. The peace that Perseus had seen in the shield had been real, and it held. He had done what the gods had asked. He had done what the king had demanded. He had killed a creature that the world called a monster, and he was flying home with the proof. But the question that had formed in him on the journey west had not been answered. It had only grown larger. Why had she been there, at the edge of the world, with serpents for hair and a face that turned men to stone? Who had made her that way? And what had he just become a part of? The sea passed beneath him, brightening from dark gray to blue as he left the perpetual dusk behind. The sun rose ahead, warm and golden, the first true sunlight he had seen in days. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like triumph. But the weight at his side kept pulling his thoughts back to the cave, to the reflection in the shield, to the face of a woman who had not looked like a monster at all. There is no need to ask whether he felt guilt. It is enough to know that he felt something, and that it was heavy, and that it did not lift when the sun touched his face. The hero's journey is always told as a story of conquest. But Perseus had just learned something that the stories rarely admit, that some victories feel like theft, and some trophies weigh more than the hands that carry them. Far below, the petrified plain stood silent in the dusk. The stone warriors still held their frozen poses. The birds still hung motionless in the gray sky. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The Gorgon was dead, but her story was not over. From the neck that the sickle had opened, something was already beginning to stir a new life, a new legacy, a bloodline that would carry her name into the world she had never been allowed to re-enter. The aftermath was just beginning. Chapter 6. What the Goddess Kept. She who could not be looked upon became the face that watched over the world. The cavern did not remain silent for long. From the place where the sickle had fallen, something was stirring, not in violence, but in emergence. A faint golden light pulsed in the darkness, and the stone floor that had received the Gorgon's blood began to warm. The sisters had fallen still at the edges of the chamber, their grief momentarily suspended by a wonder they had not anticipated. Death had opened a door, and something was coming through it. Pegasus rose first. He came forth not as a creature of flesh and blood alone, but as a thing of light and motion, his wings unfurling from the wound like dawn breaking over a dark sea. His coat was white as sea foam, his eyes bright and clear, and when he shook his great head, the sound of it echoed through the cavern like the first note of a song. He stood on legs that had never touched earth and looked at the world with the calm of something that had always existed. Chrysaor followed, and he was different, not winged, but armed, a warrior born, fully formed, golden-sworded and solemn. He emerged from the same sacred wound. But where Pegasus was flight and freedom, Chrysaor was strength and stillness. He stood beside his brother in the dim light of the cavern, and the two of them together were the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. What does a violated woman leave behind when the gods are finished with her? She left life. That was the truth the ancient sources tell us. From the neck of the woman who had been punished for another's crime came a winged horse who would carry heroes and a golden warrior who would father kings. The blood that had been spilled in a temple, the body that had been twisted into a weapon, the face that had been made too terrible to look upon, all of it had been carrying this, waiting for the moment of release. Medusa was dead, but her children were alive. Perseus did not see the birth. He was already high above the western sea, the cabesus heavy at his side, the head within it still warm. He flew without stopping, the winged sandals carrying him eastward, away from the perpetual dusk, toward the world of men and cities and the king who had sent him. Behind him, the cavern and the sisters and the petrified plain receded into legend. Ahead of him lay a journey that would change the shape of the ancient world. His first great pause came at the edge of the world's other side, where the Titan Atlas held the sky on his shoulders. The giant saw Perseus coming and remembered an old prophecy that a son of Zeus would one day steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. He tried to drive the hero away, but Perseus, exhausted and desperate, reached into the cabesus, and drew out the Gorgon's head. Atlas looked, and Atlas became stone, his beard a mountain crag, his shoulders a ridge, his bulk the great range that still bears his name. He flew on. The head was a terrible gift, a weapon that asked nothing of its wielder except the courage to carry it. Perseus did not use it lightly, but he used it. The journey home was long, and the world was full of threats that a young man with a sword could not face alone. The head became his shield and his shadow, the dark companion at his side, the thing he reached for when there was no other way. He hated it, and needed it in equal measure. The coast of Ethiopia rose from the sea like a white scar, and there he saw her. Andromeda was chained to a rock above the waves, her arms stretched wide, her dark hair blowing in the salt wind. She had been offered as a sacrifice to a sea monster, a price paid for her mother's vanity. Perseus saw her from the air and felt the world slow around him. He had not come here to find love. He had come here because the wind had carried him. But the wind, perhaps, had known. The monster came from the deep water, a vast serpentine shape that churned the sea to foam. Perseus did not hesitate. He descended like a bolt of light, the winged sandals carrying him above the creature's reach. And when the moment was right, he turned the Gorgon's head toward the beast. The sea monster looked, and the sea monster turned to stone, a ridge of gray rock that would stand in that bay for centuries, a monument to a rescue that was also a meeting. He freed her from the chains with hands that were still trembling. She looked at him, not at the cabeces, not at the head, but at him, and she saw a young man who had done something impossible and was still trying to understand what it meant. They stood together on the rocky shore, the waves lapping at their feet, and something began to grow between them that had nothing to do with monsters or gods or the weight of divine gifts. It was simply human. It was simply good. The island of Seriphos looked smaller than he remembered. The white stone of the harbor, the bright water, the fishing boats, all of it seemed like a memory from someone else's life. Perseus landed on the shore near Dictys's humble dwelling, the cabeces still heavy at his side. Inside, he found his mother Danaeath and the old fisherman huddled in the shadow of the hearth, hiding from the king who had grown cruel in his absence. Polydectes was holding a banquet when Perseus walked into the hall. The king reclined on his throne, wine in hand, his courtiers laughing at some jest that died the moment the young man appeared in the doorway. The king's eyes flickered with surprise, then hardened. He asked if the hero had brought the promised gift. Perseus reached into the cabesus and said nothing. He simply lifted the head, and the laughter stopped forever. The court of Seriphos became a garden of stone in a single heartbeat. Polydectes sat frozen on his throne, his wine cup still raised, his mouth open in a command that would never be spoken. His courtiers stood around him in attitudes of feasting and mockery, their faces caught in the instant between disbelief and terror. Perseus lowered the head and looked at what he had done. Then he turned and walked out into the sunlight, and his mother was free. He gave the kingdom to Dictys, the fisherman who had been kind when kindness was scarce. Then he began the long work of returning what had been lent. The winged sandals he gave back to Hermes, the helm of darkness to the shadows that had delivered it, the cabeces to the nymphs who had woven it. One by one, the divine gifts left his hands, and he became, gradually, simply a man again. Only the head remained, and it was not his to keep. Athena received it from him in a temple of pale marble, her gray eyes steady as they had been when she first gave him the shield. She took the head without ceremony and fixed it to her aegis, the great shield she wore into battle, the emblem of her divine authority. The face of Medusa, which had been a curse and a weapon and a prison, became something else in that moment. It became a symbol. It became a guardian. But the head was not the only legacy. From the blood that had fallen on the cavern floor, Athena had gathered 2 vials, one from the right side, one from the left. She gave them to Asclepius, the god of healing, and in those vials lay the duality of Medusa's final gift. Blood from the right could cure any sickness, mend any wound, even call the dead back to the light. Blood from the left was poison, instant and absolute. Life and death held in the same hands. Pegasus flew on. He would carry Bellerophon against the Chimera, soar through the skies of 100 stories, and when his time on earth was done, Zeus would place him among the stars. Chrysaor ruled in distant lands, fathering a lineage that would stretch across myth. The children of Medusa, born from her death, threaded through the world like veins of gold through dark stone. She had left more behind than anyone had expected. And her face, her terrible, beautiful, petrifying face, began to appear everywhere. On temple pediments and city gates, on soldier shields and household thresholds, the Gorgonians stared outward with wide, unblinking eyes. The ancient Greeks painted her not as a monster to be feared, but as a ward against fear itself. A face so potent it could repel any evil that dared approach. She who could not be looked upon became the thing the world looked to for protection. There is no need to imagine the silence of that transformation. It is enough to know that it happened slowly, over centuries, and that the woman who had been punished for another's crime became, in the end, the guardian of 1,000 doorways. The face that had been made too terrible to meet was now carved in stone above the places where children slept and offerings were made, and the vulnerable prayed for safety. She did not know any of this. She had died in a cavern at the edge of the world, her serpents still, her eyes closed, her long punishment over. But the story did not end with the blade. It rippled outward through her children, through her blood, through the face that would watch over Greece for 1,000 years. What remained was not a monster, but a meaning. And that meaning, like the Gorgonian above the temple door, is still looking down on us, waiting to be understood. Chapter 7. The Face That Outlasted the Gods. She was not a monster. She was a woman who could never be hurt again. What does it mean when a monster becomes a guardian? The ancient Greeks did not ask this question aloud, but they answered it everywhere. Walk the ruins of any Greek city, any temple precinct, any sanctuary perched on a windswept promontory, and you will find her. The Gorgonian, the face of Medusa, stares outward from pediments and metopes, from coins and shield bosses, from the thresholds of houses where families slept. She is everywhere, and she is watching. The word for this is apotropaic, from the Greek apotropaion, to turn away. The image of Medusa was believed to deflect evil, to repel the malevolent glance, to protect whatever stood behind it. A face too terrible to look upon was used to warn away the things that should not be looked upon. The logic is ancient and elegant. Only a monster can stop a monster. Only a curse can break a curse. And so the cursed woman became the charm. Her name carries the same strange inversion. Medusa derives from the Greek medion, to protect, to rule over, to guard. She who was called the guardian was made into a thing from which the world needed guarding. The etymology is not irony. It is prophecy. From the moment she was named, perhaps from the moment she was born, the shape of her purpose was already present, hidden inside the word, waiting for the myth to catch up. But the face on those temple walls is not the face of a victim. Look closely at an archaic Gorgonian, and you will see something peculiar. She is almost always depicted frontally, staring directly at the viewer, while every other figure in Greek art turns in profile. She meets your gaze. She does not flinch. The woman who could never look at another human being without killing them became, in stone and paint, the one face in all of Greek art that will look you in the eye. There were other versions of her story, even in antiquity. Pausanias, traveling through Greece in the 2nd century, recorded a tradition that Medusa was not a Gorgon at all, but a mortal queen of Libya, a woman of great beauty and military genius, who led armies into battle and died by treachery. Her body was buried in a mound near the Agora of Argos, and the petrifying gaze was a metaphor for the paralyzing effect of her beauty and her tactical brilliance. Diodorus Siculus went further. In his account, the Gorgons were a tribe of warrior women in North Africa, skilled in combat and fiercely independent. They resisted the expansion of neighboring kingdoms, and their reputation for ferocity grew until it crossed the sea and became myth. Perseus, in this telling, was not a slayer of monsters, but a conqueror of a rival people. The petrifying gaze was the terror that a woman with power has always inspired in those who wish she had none. These rationalizing traditions are not dismissals of the myth. They are evidence of its depth. A story that can be told as divine punishment, as military history, and as psychological allegory is a story that has touched something real. The Greeks returned to Medusa again and again, in different registers and different genres, because she refused to be settled. She meant too many things. She still does. The archaeological record tells its own version. The earliest Gorgonia appear in the 8th century before the Common Era, painted on pottery, stamped on bronze shields, carved into the pediments of the first stone temples. They are wild and terrifying, with bulging eyes, protruding tongues, and serpents coiling around the face like a lion's mane. This is the Medusa of pure apotropopaic power, the monster's monster, the face that scares away the dark. But over the centuries, something changed. The archaic Gorgon, with her gaping mouth and ferocious stare, softened into something almost human. By the classical period, Medusa's face on coins and temple decorations had become beautiful, still ringed with serpents, still powerful, but serene. The terror did not vanish, but it was joined by something else. Tragedy, perhaps, or recognition. The Greeks were beginning to see the woman inside the weapon. The Hellenistic and Roman periods completed the transformation. Medusa appeared in mosaics and wall paintings not as a horror, but as a melancholy beauty. Her serpents stylized into elegant curls. Her expression sorrowful rather than threatening. The apotropaic function remained. Her face still guarded the thresholds, but the meaning had deepened. She was no longer simply a monster to be feared. She was a being to be mourned, and the mourning had crept into the stone itself. What happened between the archaic grimace and the Hellenistic sigh was not a forgetting. It was an understanding. The Greeks who carved those later faces had lived with Medusa's image for centuries, and they had begun to grasp what the myth had always contained beneath its surface of terror. She was not a monster who happened to have been a woman. She was a woman who had been made into a monster, and the making mattered. The Temple of Artemis at Corfu bears one of the earliest and most striking Gorgonaea in Greek architecture, a massive limestone pediment from the early 6th century, with Medusa at its center, flanked by her children and her beasts. She is wild-eyed and serpent-haired, but she is also positioned at the very heart of a sacred space. The worshipper entered beneath her gaze. The goddess was protected by the face of a woman who had been punished by a goddess. The circle of meaning was already turning. There is no need to search for her face in every museum. It is enough to know that she is there in the bronze Gorgonion from the Athenian Agora, in the terracotta plaques from Paestum, in the silver coins of Athens, and the gold jewelry of the Bosporan kingdom, from Spain to the Black Sea, from the Archaic Age to the Roman. The face of Medusa was one of the most reproduced images in the ancient Mediterranean. Only the gods themselves were more present. And what of the mound at Argos? Pausanias described it as a simple earthwork in the Agora, the grave of a mortal queen. No serpents, no petrifying gaze, no gods. Just a woman who led armies and died, and whose body was returned to the earth with honor. The story is almost certainly not historical, but it does not need to be. It tells us that even in antiquity, there were those who looked at the myth and saw not a Gorgon, but a queen. Diodorus saw a tribe of warriors. Pausanias saw a buried monarch. Hesiod saw a daughter of the old sea gods, born monstrous at the edge of the world. Ovid saw a victim. Each of these visions is a facet of the same truth. And the truth is that Medusa has always been a mirror. What you see in her face depends on where you are standing and what you are willing to recognize. The Gorgonian is the only image in Greek art that looks directly at the viewer. Every kouros, every goddess, every hero on every vase turns away in profile, absorbed in their own world. But Medusa stares out. She meets your eyes. The woman whose gaze could not be met became, in the language of stone and paint, the one figure who will never look away from you. The Greeks did not need to write this down. They carved it. There is a quiet companionship in that stare, if you are willing to receive it. Not the terror of the monster, but the vigilance of the guardian. The face above the doorway is not there to threaten. It is there to watch, to protect, to turn away whatever dark thing approaches the threshold. This is what the ancient world understood, and what we have largely forgotten. Medusa is not a horror story. She is a shield. The violated woman became the protector. The cursed became the cure. The blood that fell from her severed neck was gathered and given to the god of healing. The head that was taken as a trophy was fixed to the armor of the goddess who had condemned her. The face that was made too terrible to look upon was painted on shields and carved above doorways and stamped into coins that passed through 1,000 hands. She was everywhere. She still is. There is a version of this story where she is only a monster, and Perseus is only a hero, and the blade is the end of it. But that version is incomplete. The blade was not the end. It was the beginning of her second life. The life in stone. The life in symbol. The life that has outlasted every temple, every city, every god who touched her story. Athena's cult has faded. Poseidon's shrines are ruins. But Medusa's face is still looking out from museum walls and book covers, in the quiet places where we still, without quite knowing why, feel watched over. She did not choose the serpents. She did not choose the exile. She did not choose the blade. But she endured all of it, and what remained was not a monster, but a meaning. Her name meant guardian. Her face became a shield. And if you stand very still in the doorway of an ancient temple, in the last light of a fading afternoon, you might feel it still, that gaze, that vigil, that woman who is never allowed to look away, watching over you with eyes that have seen everything, and still, somehow, refuse to close.